is shamanic light theory, or how a shaman tells time. I'll begin it as it is generally begun by shamans, using the simplest of examples. The universe is like an egg. The how and the why of it being like an egg is what defines the nature of physical reality. In reality, we are all defined by atomic form. Atomic form defines every other form. It is the microcosm that defines the macrocosm. Atomic form appears to be perfectly spherical. However, if you observe atoms closely enough, you'll discover that each and every one of them has a dimple at a certain point in their surface. The surface is an appearance of solidity in an atom that is not actual. We know that because it's really created by the movement of electrons around the nucleic center. And the reality is that the electrons cannot actually take up every spot in space around the nucleic center. It results in a permanency of a dimple that has to do with a polar correlate to north-south, positive, negative. Because that is the building block for everything else, it defines the shape of everything else. That dimple essentially indicates that nothing is perfectly spherical. It is all ovoid or elliptical, as demonstrated in our midcosm of an egg. That actually translates further to the macrocosm of solar orbit. In other words, that's what occurs in a solar system. That is what planetary orbit looks like from a long enough distance. It is not perfectly circular, it is ovoid. The reason for that has to do with gravitational center. Gravitational center always pulls harder, and because it pulls harder, it creates an energetic depression that attracts the orbiting body to come closer to orbital center when it reaches that point of orbit than it does when it goes away from orbital center. Therefore, it generates a charge, and essentially it structures the nature of time-space. As such, time-space has a stretched and condensed feeling to it. This is because of the fundamental generation of time-space, which is not atomic form, but it is that which creates atomic form. Essentially, it's sublight and then light. Light is what creates form. All forms are created by light, defined by light, bound about by light. And the ovoid shape of an atomic particle is reflective of the essential ovoid nature of the structure of the bandwidths of light, as identified in solar definition, as well as the microcosm and the midcosm. And then when you take that principle and apply it to the triplicate nature of the structure of time-space, which is essentially orienting one to an individual observer. The individual observer stands, and then the individual observer is bound about by the object the observer is on, which is going to orbit around the center of the system that the observer is a part of. In this case, we're going to call it a solar system. So you're going to need a triplicate layer in order to orient the individual to time-space reality in the natural ovoid structure that occurs because of atomic formation and because of the bandwidths of light. So you essentially create an orientation where you take the observer and you layer the solar system, and then you layer the galaxy within that the solar system lies within. And then, of course, because you assume orbit, the planet around the sun around the galaxy, then you assume that the galaxy orbits around the universe, more or less, thus yielding a triplicate structure. This would be the solar system, this is the galaxy, and this is the universe. When you layer those together and you lay the bandwidths of light on the outside, as was done in that illustration, you discover that the bandwidths correlate exactly to the structure of essential universal orbit. You must lay the darker wavelengths, the deeper wavelengths, on the furthest point of orbit, what we would call aphelion, what we here on the planet refer to as winter solstice. The furthest point of orbit, the furthest point away from the center, and perihelion correlates to the closest point of orbit, closest to the center. Essentially, you have to lay the lightest bandwidth on top of the closest point, because that's the brightest point of orbit. It's when you're going to be closest to the center, in this case a star, in all cases a star, because truly that does define it. The nucleus will be the light provided when you're considering it on the atomic level. So when you lay it that way, you discover why wavelengths appear the way they do, really. You discover why shadow and light exist, and the center of perception does tend to correlate toward the white light at the top and the shadow at the bottom. So in our illustration, you can see that essentially you receive the wavelength definition as dark because of the mixture of red and purple, and the perception shunting straight down, and white is the result of the stretch of yellow and the perception looking straight up. These bandwidths are revealed to be the shape that they are. It's illustrating essentially that orange and green are very thin bandwidths, and that red and blue are very wide bandwidths, and that yellow contains a very special sort of component. Now, if you really want to test this out, you're going to have to do it on an inner level. You cannot actually test this out on an external level unless you have built-in sonar. Now, we're not dolphins, we're humans having this conversation. So the way to compensate for that naturally as a human is to learn to meditate, to learn to internally perceive color rather than externally. If you close your eyes for long enough and you work yourself past the black and white static or the simple blackness, you'll discover that you'll have flickers and flashes of color. That internal perception of color indicates that you can see color without sight. So to test what I say about the stretch of bandwidths and that correlation to time-space and it correlating to the nature of atomic structure, and that being the fundamental structure of everything in the universe, you use a solar eclipse. You must be focused and centered as a meditator, and you must never ever look at it with your eyes open unless you would like to test how blind you can become when you look at a solar eclipse, which is not the point and purpose of this. So you would have your eyes closed, you'd meditate with your ajna, the reflection of your medulla, which is really the result of an awareness of all the energetic nexi on your spine, which we all are aware of. We know that there is a certain correlation behind our heart, a certain correlation at the back of our neck, and a certain correlation at the back of our skull. You perceive that in the front of your skull, and you orient that directly toward the solar eclipse at totality, and if you have meditated enough, you will perceive the actual bandwidth emanating from outside of an eclipse. What you will see is this, truly anchored and truly perceptive. The eclipse, the corona, around the corona you will see scintillations that flicker back and forth between red and purple. After that, you will see a deep indigo color, and then blue stretching all the way back to right about here. At that point, you will perceive a thin ring of sparkling, scintillating emerald that's just at the corner of your peripheral vision, your internal peripheral vision. After that, you begin to feel this mellow butter sort of color right here all the way up at the crown of your head. The perception stretches right here to form a shaft of brilliant white in the center of it. The yellow ends becomes a thin band of pulsing orange. The orange ends becomes a much larger bandwidth of red, shading from bright, vibrant to deep crimson at the edges. Now, if you can anchor your perception and spin yourself 180 internally, not externally, so that you can essentially look through the back, you will see that directly correlated to the eclipse and the obscuring body is an empty space at the edges of red. That empty space will be roughly 3 times the size of the eclipse and the obscuring body. And essentially at the very edge, if you can concentrate of red, it fades into a rusty crimson, and then it is essentially empty, and you can see the apparent vacancy of space, but you do perceive stars so that you understand that it is not actually black. It is only an invisible perception of such. So that essentially displays the natural size of the bandwidths of light that is displayed in a 2-dimensional form as equidistant in a rainbow. And the rainbow more or less proves that the mingling of red and purple produces your apparency of black. It is not an actuality. Black is really only a perceptive shadow. So, in this way, we understand that we are both surrounded by rainbows, that those rainbows are completely separated and correlated to specific bandwidths that can energetically align us with perception. This is shamanic light theory. You need to think about it.